I'm Jim Dewey, and this is Combating the Narrative. So one of you guys suggested this guy to me. His YouTube channel is called Badempanada, and he's something of a genuinely interesting character. So in browsing through a couple of his videos and scrolling through his homepage, this is a guy who's about as far left as you can go on the political spectrum. He holds Americans, imperialists, capitalists, and Westerners in general, read white people, for all the ills that have befallen South America, and really the world at large. This is a man who dreams of the day that a violent revolution will come. So naturally it needs to be addressed, and I feel I'm the man to do it. But in this day and age and political climate, revolutionaries like these are a dime a dozen. So what makes them interesting? Well, he's got this bizarre hate boner for Vaush, which, frankly, I just don't understand. Like, this is a man who, generally speaking, is politically aligned with you and your goals. Like, why are you spending all this time and dedicating a good chunk of your channels to attacking him? Like, it's really weird. Like, did he do something to you personally? I don't know. Maybe one of you guys can fill me in on the lore. But at any rate, this particular video is him slamming Vaush in a stream. He's slamming him for a remark that the Founding Fathers of the United States were well-meaning intellectuals and good revolutionaries who ended up creating a bad final product in the United States. Now, I could address that point in and of itself, but this video's on Badempanada. And with that, here we go.
They're a nuclear country that's a satellite state for China.
But I didn't say anything. I didn't say anything about the DPR.
What is a nuclear country that's a satellite state for China? God, what the fuck does that mean?
Okay, so right off the bat, this guy doesn't know anything about North Korea, apparently. Not off to a great start. I'm already getting a sneaking suspicion this guy isn't the brightest.
It exists currently.
But if you look back at the history of the North Korean forces, they weren't ever good. Like, if you want to take a look at, like, what happens when good revolutionaries build a country that's bad and hypocritical, look at the American Founding Fathers. The American Founding Fathers, for... you know?
The American Founding Fathers were good revolutionaries? What?
Yes.
What the fuck is he talking about? The American Founding Fathers were a bunch of fucking slave owners who rebelled against the British Crown for not allowing them to conquer as much indigenous land as they wanted to. They were land speculators who had on paper ownership of unconquered, unceded Indian lands, each and every one of them basically. They were not good revolutionaries. They were going to war for personal gain. What the fuck are you talking about? Not just for personal gain, but for personal gain because they wanted to literally conquer and eliminate indigenous people from existence. They were good revolutionaries.
Okay, what? Are you going for the world record on most politically charged historical lies told in 30 seconds? Now he's got a long list of charges he levels against the American Founding Fathers here. Let's take them apart one by one, starting from the beginning. Now, American Founding Father is a very nebulous term, because he's just spouting off at the mouth and not defining what it is he means exactly. I'm going to have to try and cobble together an argument on his behalf. Now, if he means by Founding Fathers the American people at large, well, let's take a look at the 1790 census. As of 1790, 17.2% of American families owned slaves. Bear in mind, this is families, not individuals. And of these 17.2%, 91% of them owned less than 20 slaves, 55% of them owned less than 5 slaves, and 24.5% of them owned 1 slave. So if you're defining Founding Fathers by all Americans of that generation, then no, that's a bold-faced lie. The vast, vast majority did not own slaves. And those that did, by and large, weren't operating these huge plantations to generate tons and tons and tons of wealth on the backs of slaves. No, they owned very few of them, by and large. Okay, let's say that by Founding Fathers, he means those with political power that had a hand in the foundation of the American government. Okay, cool, let's take a look at that. I don't know a better cross-section of people fitting that definition than Constitutional Convention attendees. So, how many of the people who attended the Constitutional Convention owned slaves? Well, only about 31%. Again, certainly not a vast majority, and certainly not, quote, each and every one of them, basically, as he will later go on to claim. Okay, cool. So if we're claiming the Founding Fathers are evil, it can't be because of rampant slave ownership, because, the vast majority, basically everybody, didn't own slaves. And you also need to bear in mind that the Founding Fathers weren't a monolith. Yes, many of the founders did own slaves. Many of them were pro-slavery. But many of them also weren't. Even at the time, this was a contentious, hot-button issue. I mean, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 banned slavery from the Northwest Territory. There was much debate surrounding the institution of slavery in the Constitutional Convention, which eventually ended in a compromise to end the slave trade in 1808. But compromises had to be made. The debate over slavery was tabled so that the greater good of forging an effective government could be accomplished, and this government was predicated on compromise by necessity. Now, moving on to his next point. The American Founding Fathers are double plus bad because they rebelled against the British Crown for not allowing them to conquer as much indigenous land as they want. Now again, you'll have to forgive me because I'm going to have to cobble together an argument on his behalf because he provides no examples. He just makes claims. Like, I wish he made a concrete claim so I could address it, because that would make my job a lot easier here, and this video probably a lot shorter. Now, in addressing this point, the Founding Fathers actually listed out the reasons they were separating from the British Crown. In the Declaration of Independence, they have a list of 27 grievances, which I'm going to read right here, right now. So here's the stated reasoning of why the Founding Fathers left, and why King George III was a bad king. He has refused his assent to laws the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance, unless suspended in their operation till his assent should be obtained, and when suspended he has utterly neglected to attend to them. He has refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people, unless those people would relinquish the right of representation in the legislature, a right inestimable to them and formidable to tyrants only. He has called together legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the depository of their public records, for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures. He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing with manly firmness his invasions on the rights of the people. He has refused for a long time after such dissolutions to cause others to be elected, whereby the legislative powers, incapable of annihilation, have returned to the people at large for their exercise, the state remaining, in the meantime, exposed to all dangers of invasion from without and convulsions within. He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states, for that purpose obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migrations hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriations of lands. He has obstructed the administration of justice by refusing his assent to laws for establishing judiciary powers. He has made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices and the amount and payment of their salaries. He has erected a multitude of new offices, and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. He has kept among us, in times of peace, standing armies without the consent of our legislatures. He has affected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power. He has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation, for quartering large bodies of armed troops among us, for protecting them, by a mock trial, from punishment for any murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states, for cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, for imposing taxes on us without our consent, for depriving us, in many cases, of the benefit of trial by jury, for transporting us beyond seas to be tried for pretended offenses, for abolishing the free system of English laws in a neighboring province, establishing therein an arbitrary government, and enlarging its boundaries to render it at once an example and fit instrument for introducing the same absolute rule into these colonies, for taking away our charters, abolishing our most valuable laws, and altering fundamentally the forms of our governments, for suspending our own legislatures, and declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever. He He has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. He is, at this time, transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny already begun with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages, and unworthy the head of a civilized nation. He has constrained our fellow citizens taken captive on the high seas to bear arms against their country, to become the executioners of their friends and brethren, or to fall themselves by their hands. He has excited domestic insurrections among us, and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. So of this list of 27 severe abuses of the colonists by the British Crown, only 2 of them can even possibly be construed to have anything to do with the appropriation of new lands and extermination of the indigenous people there. So my question for you, Badempanada, is whether or not you consider anything on that list to be trivial, or deny that it happened, or believe that it's not sufficient cause for revolution. Because making the claim that the Founding Fathers revolted from the British Empire because they weren't allowed to steal Indian land and murder Indians seems to imply so. And yes, I am aware that what you're probably referring to is colonial outrage over the 1763 Royal Proclamation line. I've addressed this in another video, but I'll cover it briefly here. So, the Royal Proclamation line of 1763 was a geographical boundary put in place by the British Crown after the acquisition of a bunch of new territory west of the Appalachians after their war with the French, known as the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian Wars on the continent. Now, this proclamation line, in the eyes of the British Crown, was put in place to protect the colonists. It was known that this territory was populated with merciless Indian savages, who regularly committed unprovoked, heinous acts of violence against white colonists. Now, at this point in time, the British Crown being in the sort of debt it was, and with more conflict with the French appearing likely, the British were not interested in getting into yet another Indian war on behalf of colonists they could not protect adequately. So, this proclamation line was set up, not as a permanent boundary, but rather as a temporary line until orderly settlement could be organized sometime down the road. This proclamation also prohibited private acquisition through treaty of Indian lands because this has proved to be a problem in the past. Why was it a problem? Because the Indians have a hard time adhering to their own treaties. Now, this boundary line was adjusted in relatively short order, in part due to the demands of the colonists. See the map here showing the Treaty of Fort Stanwix and the Treaty of Hard Labor. Now, the nuance you're also missing here, and this is key to why this was so frustrating to the British colonists in America at the time, is that a large section of this land was carved out and granted to the Canadian people newly incorporated into the British Crown. Imagine for a moment that you're a colonist who had fought and suffered in the French and Indian Wars, only to have the territory you fought on and for be granted to your former adversaries. Furthermore, as mentioned as one of the grievances in the Declaration of Independence, the free British system of common law was abolished in this territory. In the minds of the colonists, this was a dangerous precedent. If it could happen in territory adjacent to their own, why couldn't the British monarchy simply abolish English common law in the American colonies? Another nuance you seem to miss is the political situation of the Indian tribes you seem to care so much about. They weren't some put-upon, oppressed, singular monolith. There were dozens upon dozens of tribes who had been warring with each other for centuries before white people set foot on that land, and continued to war with each other long after the Europeans had arrived. Furthermore, many were aligned with certain European powers, and many were opposed to certain European powers. That is to say, certain Indian tribes were perfectly happy to use European military might to further their own political wants and desires. I mean, just look at the belligerent section of any Wikipedia article about the military conflicts going on in this region at this time. And now I want you to provide some sort of citation to the ridiculous claim you make that there was somehow some sort of government-sanctioned policy to exterminate Indians and brown people in the United States. That never happened. Now you need to come up with some sort of citation for that horrible claim, that egregious lie, or admit that you're nothing but a charlatan trying to peddle this blood libel of yours to justify villainous political action against your modern-day political opponents. What, are you going to point to some sort of military atrocity? I'm well aware of them. I'm also well aware that this wasn't some sort of one-sided affair. It was a bloody back and forth, and yes, there were evil atrocities committed on both sides, as there are in any war. There are too many to individually name, and they're by far committed by Indians rather than white people. Here, I'll link the Wikipedia article, and maybe you can educate yourself so we can try and have some semblance of an intellectual conversation. Now, while you try and do some mental gymnastics to spin this to fit your narrative, here, why don't you chew on this? To go back to the Northwest Ordinance, let's take a look at the official U.S. government policy on relations with the Indian tribes. Article 3 of the Northwest Ordinance reads, "Religion, morality, and knowledge, being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged. The utmost good faith shall always be observed towards the Indians. Their lands and property shall never be taken from them without their consent, and in their property, rights, and liberty they shall never be invaded or disturbed, unless in just and lawful wars authorized by Congress. But laws founded in justice and humanity shall from time to time be made for preventing wrongs being done to them and for preserving peace and friendship with them." So there you have it. That's the official policy of the founders of this nation who you claim set out to exterminate these people. Or perhaps he wants to point to the Indian Removal Act of 1830. This act forced many Indian tribes to relocate from their territory. Many did so peaceably, but others had to be forced by the United States Army. This is commonly referred to as the Trail of Tears. But do you know why this act passed Congress? Why this was done? Most, yourself included, probably assume that this is done out of malice or some desire to see the Indians destroyed. But actually the opposite is true. Let's take a look at some statements from the debate on Indian removal in Congress. To quote Andrew Jackson on the passage of this bill, "Humanity has often wept over the fate of the aborigines of this country, and philanthropy has been long busily employed in devising means to avert it. But its progress has never for a moment been arrested, and one by one have many powerful tribes disappeared from the earth. To follow to the tomb of the last of his race and to tread on the graves of extinct nations excite melancholy reflections. But true philanthropy reconciles the mind to these vicissitudes as it does to the extinction of one generation to make room for another. In the monuments and fortresses of an unknown people, spread over the extensive regions of the West, we behold the memorials of a once powerful race, which was exterminated or has disappeared to make room for the exiting savage tribes. Nor is there anything in this which, upon a comprehensive view of the general interests of the human race, is to be regretted. Philanthropy could not wish to see this continent restored to the conditions in which it was found by our forefathers. What good man would prefer a country covered with forests and ranged by a few thousand savages to our extensive republic, studded with cities, towns, and prosperous farms, embellished with all the improvements which art can devise or industry execute, occupied by more than 12 million happy people, and filled with all the blessings of liberty, civilization, and religion? The present policy of the government is but a continuation of the same progressive change by a milder process. The tribes which occupied the countries now constituting the eastern states were annihilated or have melted away to make room for the whites. The waves of population and civilization are rolling to the westward, and we now propose to acquire the countries occupied by the red man of the south and west by a fair exchange, and, at the expense of the United States, to send them to a land where their existence may be prolonged and perhaps made perpetual." Now, reading stuff like that makes me certain that people in the past were simply bigger brained than we are today. So, to simplify, the annihilation of the Indian tribes by their refusal to assimilate was foreseen by the founders and their progeny. And if these men were truly the genocidal maniacs that Badempanada makes them out to be, you would think that they would be over the moon with joy at such a conclusion. But they're not. They're deeply saddened. Saddened to the point that they take steps to ensure the continuation of the Indian race, a policy which, were the roles reversed as they are in the present day, I should doubt would have been afforded to whites. The Indians were compensated for their land and moved at government expense to an area set aside for them specifically so they could keep living in the ways of their ancestors and continue to exist as a race and people and culture, or otherwise they would not. But no, what you take from this is the founders and the people that followed wanted to kill all indigenous people. They wanted to break away from the British Empire so they could do worse things to the indigenous people. They wanted full-scale Indian genocide. They weren't principled intellectuals founding a government the likes of which had never been seen on this earth, a government the likes of which was used to model virtually every modern democracy. No, they just wanted to conquer. I mean, what a small-brained take. As with anyone I criticize on this channel, I would love to have a debate with this guy, but I suspect that will never come to fruition. If you've watched to this point, clearly you're enjoying the content, and I would ask that, first and foremost, you share this content with anyone who needs to hear it, and also like and subscribe to the channel. It makes me really feel like this is something worth doing. But with that, I'll leave you with a few minutes of Badempanada completely lacking self-awareness and criticizing Vaush for doing the exact same things he went on to do in this video. As a bit of an aside, I want you to notice how freely these men like Badempanada and Vaush talk about the concept of a violent revolution to achieve their political aims. Frightening.
For all the shitty fucking things they did, actually...
No, they were not good revolutionaries in spite of all the shitty things they did. They were just shitty revolutionaries. What are you talking about? They weren't revolutionaries at all. They wanted to break apart from the British Empire so that they could basically do even worse things than what the British Empire was already allowing them to do. Jesus Christ.
Like, for the most part, pretty principled intellectuals that fought pretty hard to get certain positions. Not the abolition of slavery, but...
Is that the only thing he thinks there was, the abolition of slavery? They wanted to kill all indigenous people. They wanted to kill or expel all indigenous people and take all of their land for themselves and give it to exclusively white people. Well, you see, you can't respond to him because he doesn't provide examples. He just makes statements without backing them up ever. Like... When I talk about these things, I always finish my sentence with, for example, this and that, and I can explain to you why. He can't. He doesn't even try. His audience just accepts it. And just fucking making shit up. You're making shit up while playing video games. Oh my god, like, how do you even respond to someone who just doesn't live in reality, who just makes up their own reality as they're going along, and states completely bullshit bonkers ideas as if they're just self-evidently true? He doesn't actually offer you anything to argue against. He just, like, makes idiotic statements without providing any context for them. Not fucking people like Latin American revolutionaries appropriating farms from the aristocracy. Boo. Does anyone watch this, man? Like, how does anyone watch this? How are the people who watch this so dumb they consider it insightful? I cannot, man. This is the issue. Like, Vaush went on for so long, talking about so many different things there, that the guy that he's talking to couldn't even respond to his completely idiotic thing about the American revolutionaries being good. The American revolutionaries who wanted full-scale indigenous genocide. Like, if he thinks Putin is bad for wanting to conquer Ukraine, how could he ever possibly say that the American founding fathers were good but flawed revolutionaries? How could you possibly fucking say that? They wanted to conquer all of the USA, and they duly did. He just threw out so many fucking contradictory, idiotic statements at once that it's impossible for his opponent to respond to them. He somehow went from saying, like, 5 completely insane and just completely historically false things without providing a single example to saying, oh, and also NATO is good at the end. And then his opponent just can only respond to the NATO is good point.
Use terms that dichotomous. I think people who have an interest in establishing, like, things like socialism or backing proletarian revolutions internationally should oppose an institution that, 1, functions as an arm of the United States militarily, 2, as we've agreed, in the event of such an international proletarian revolution, would have no qualms squashing such a revolution.
Why do you keep bringing that up? NATO doesn't change that part of the equation.
Why is it relevant that this European American military alliance would destroy any socialist revolution? Why do you bring that up? Why do you bring that up? It's not fair. It's not fair that you state very basic facts about the world. Yeah, I support socialism, but I also support the military alliance and the imperialist countries that would strike it down. This makes sense. Okay.